So the downside of the burnout, it's real. It's already calculated. There are billions of dollars that are being lost in productivity that is being lost due to employee retention suffers, productivity suffers due to motivation. We also talk about kind of culture of innovation and the downside and the upside of that culture of innovation that comes to that since we're in Silicon Valley. So it's a beautiful way to establish the value of innovation, the growth mindset, being resilient to disruption, and so on and so forth. A lot of times it comes with a pressure to innovate, right? That's the downside of it. So how do you balance these things within the organization? But what I really love talking about is how leadership really starts with self-leadership.
Welcome to another episode of From Startup to Wunderbrand with Nicholas Kuhner.
Today, we are joined by the marvelous Victoria Mensch, who's honed a unique approach to sustainable success, developed over years in the fast-paced tech landscape of Silicon Valley. Victoria has dedicated her career to mastering burnout-proof leadership. With executive experience across both large corporations and agile tech startups, she's led teams through the intense demands of rapid innovation, focusing on achieving a competitive edge without sacrificing personal well-being. So I hope you are ready to get some insights onto how to maintain a high level of success while staying mentally and emotionally balanced. And in this episode, we're going to uncover her blueprint for burnout-proof leadership, strategies designed to foster sustainable growth, ensuring your journey to success doesn't come at the cost of your health or happiness. So with no further introduction, hi, Victoria.
What a great introduction. Thank you so much, Nicholas. I'm really happy to be here.
So I want to go a little bit into your background first, because you're talking about burnout and leadership. So I want to give people some context in terms of how do you know what you're talking about? Because there are a lot of coaches and a lot of executives out there who talk about leadership and burnout, but actually haven't gone through that process themselves. I'm not saying you've had burnout yourself, but let's just have a look at your background. You've got an MBA from Berkeley in high-tech marketing. You've worked at the Silicon Valley Innovation Center. You're a senior VP for product and marketing at SAP and had to deal with HANA. So you definitely had some burnout.
I actually challenge you to find a leader who has not gone through burnout. So all those coaches and leaders, when they talk about burnout, most likely they talk out of the and I certainly have my personal experience with burnouts, went through quite a few of those and took some actions to prevent them. Some of those actions were kind of very nice and measured and practical. Some of those might not have been. So that's where I'm coming from, right? So my first experience really out of the high school, I really want to be a psychologist. So I went ahead and I got my degree in psychology. I got a master's degree, I got a PhD degree, and I started working with people finally, only to find out a year into that I probably made a mistake. So yeah, I followed my passion. I heard the voice. I followed my passion. I did all the steps and everything. And then it turns out for sure it's a job, that for sure it was the wrong choice. For sure it was the wrong job for me. So what I did, I pivoted in a different career, in a corporate career. Only a few years later to find myself in another kind of burnout. And then I started thinking it might not have been a career. So that's, I think, what's interesting about the burnout is that we do experience that. Whether you're a high achieving leader, whether you're an executive, an entrepreneur, and a founder, that might be a little bit more acute. But almost everyone in our day and age, almost everyone has some kind of a level of experience with the burnout.
I want to ask you, what is burnout? I mean, I can give you my experience of burnout, but what types of burnout are there and how can one identify it? And the reason I'm asking this is that a lot of the folks listening to this are in their entrepreneurial journey or are starting businesses or going into their careers. They've never seen burnout. They don't know what burnout is. Maybe explain what is burnout and why shouldn't you try and avoid it?
Probably experiencing it. They just don't have the label for it. What burnout is, I think it's a consensus now in terms of the definition. It's a chronic stress reaction. So all of us experience stress. We all know what a stress is. And so many things can stress us out. The job tends to be, one of the really stressful factors when you're an entrepreneur and you have all these responsibilities and you have all these goals and you have all these demands from so many people who are dependent on you. You stress out about that as well. So that's kind of the stress that accumulates over time, over and over and over again, and never gets fully released. That becomes a chronic stress. So that's kind of a physiological mechanism of that. The way you experience this could be different. It really depends on how you experience stress. One of the red threads in the burnout kind of symptoms is a feeling of exhaustion. You feel exhausted, you feel tired. And that this kind of tiredness when you really cannot get enough rest. So you can sleep for a long time, you can get a vacation, only to come back and experience that tiredness again. So that's kind of a red thread. Psychologically, it could be lack of motivation. You're not interested in what you do. But in terms of kind of other factors, again, physiological factors, it really depends on how you experience stress. If your manifestation of stress is that you lose sleep, then probably you like lost your sleep for over, a couple of weeks, right? So you cannot sleep. Maybe you'll sleep too much. So some people, their reaction to stress is that they actually sleep a lot. So if you notice that, that could be your kind of red flag that you might be entering that burnout phase. Or, sometimes it could be changes in appetite. Some people lose appetite. Some people start craving all this, fatty and sweet things. So that would be very personal for you, how your system reacts to stress. On the psychological level, as I said, it's lack of motivation, lack of productivity, some things that, used to take you a couple of minutes. Now, like you drag them over 2 weeks, and that sense of exhaustion.
Now, I've had some good successes and some equally horrific failures in my business. And I've had burnout, I think, in both of them. So I think burnout can be both when you are successful, but also, obviously, I think people mainly only take care of burnout when things are going bad. And what happened with me is that I couldn't breathe properly. I felt like I just could never take a full breath. And that was pretty nasty. Maybe talk to me about leadership and the importance of managing burnout, because the two options I've given here, and these are just mine that I've, came off the top of my head, but is there a difference between burnout when you are successful versus when you are unsuccessful? And then we'll go into a little bit about how leadership, how you can use tools and guidance from yourself, for example, to avoid burnout in a leadership position.
Yeah, so I think that burnout, right, given that it's a chronic stress reaction. So whenever we go into that stress reaction and it doesn't get relieved over time and becomes chronic, that's a burnout. It could be, you could be successful or not successful. It could be related to your job. It could be related to your family situation. So this is really not necessarily job related. So one of the things that we attach so much significance to our jobs, right? And it has a lot of implications, whether you're an entrepreneur or you're a hired employee. So this is actually, it's a source of your livelihood, right? So it's a source of your purpose in a lot of sense. For a lot of people, it's a source of your identity. So there's a lot of importance attached to that. And so that's why we kind of tend to see burnout in those situations, because we assign those, significance kind of to the points like if we lose that, then it's a life-threatening situation, which immediately pushes us into this stressful mode, right? The fight or flight mode. So that's kind of a prelude to what you said, whether it's successful and unsuccessful. At the end of the day, stress reaction is a stress reaction. Our survival system doesn't really distinguish that much, whether it's an imaginary stress or it's a real stress, imaginary threat, or it's a real threat, right? It just goes into that survival mode. It mobilizes everything, all physiological systems. It shuts down a lot of system and really goes into this fight or flight. So that's the only two options you have. Either you flee the scene or you attack, right? But you never actually take any actions. Like, what can you do? It's like if you're a hired employee, you truly don't know whether layoffs are coming, right? So it's really outside of your control. So you can't really finish that stress reaction. You just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. So that's how it works. So for us to really think, how do we prevent that? I think it's important to realize that there's things that are outside of our control, but there are a lot of things that are inside of our control, and distinguish those. So you as an employee, you probably wouldn't have a visibility on whether you're going to be laid off or not. So this is this thing that's outside of your control. What's inside of your control? Inside of your control is what the priorities are. Did you actually have time to recharge your energy, or you, I don't know, watch Netflix all night long because you couldn't, calm down your nervous system? Did you, did you go through your gratitude practice, for example, or did you set the boundaries? Did you relinquish unnecessary control, right? So all those things, these are the practices that you want to establish for yourself. So you feel in control, right? So that control that's inside you, you realize what you can control, you take charge, and you practice it over and over again. And that what will help you to be in that sustainable, productive mode, rather than in unsustainable mode, worrying about the things that you really cannot influence. I will give you an example. Sometimes I would hear something in the news that, I don't know, there is a flood somewhere in Nigeria and a lot of people died. And that puts me in this stressful mode. There is nothing I can do about that. Maybe I can send money to support them, but there's nothing else I can do about that. But my system is already in the survival mode, right? So I need to have the tools and the practices to push it back into the normal kind of rest and digest mode. So that's the secret sauce.
I suppose, obviously we all want to be unstressed, and our organizations need us to be unstressed so that we can operate at the optimal level. And it reminds me of a wonderful saying my father always says, which is, worry is the only vice that doesn't give you pleasure. I knew I'd get it out. So this talks now into some of the management strategies and self-leadership and creating more balance. So this takes us to the Silicon Valley Executive Academy and the work that you do there. So can you maybe talk about some of the services and the, not treatments, but some of the processes that you go through to help leaders in particular?
Yes, there are certainly corporate programs that can be put in place that would have this well-being kind of as a priority or as a value for the organization. So what it usually does, it creates a culture where people can express themselves much more freely, so they can give back to the organization much more than they would be in a kind of, more authoritarian and control environment, or the environment where well-being is not one of the values, right? So we have programs like that. How do you create an environment of this? And we kind of teach leaders what would be the steps of this culture that would help them to have a more autonomous and more motivated workforce. So the downside of the burnout, it's real. It's already calculated. There are billions of dollars that are being lost in productivity that is being lost due to the burnout. The retention, employee retention suffers, productivity suffers due to motivation. So it actually makes sense to establish all those practices. We also talk about kind of culture of innovation and the downside and the upside of that culture of innovation that comes to that, since we're in Silicon Valley, right? So it's a beautiful way to establish the value of innovation, the growth mindset, being resilient to disruption and so on and so forth. A lot of times it comes with a pressure to innovate, right? That's the downside of it. So how do you balance these things within the organization? But what I really love talking about is how leadership really starts with self-leadership. And it's not necessarily that you need to be in a managerial capacity to do that, though it absolutely helps. So once you become that role model of the person that you want to be and people you want to see around you, right? So it really trickles down into the organizational culture. So things like that, we talk about gratitude, for example, the practice of gratitude. What it is on a personal level is you practice noticing things you like instead of things you don't like, which sounds simple, right? So it's not easy, but simple. What it really means from when you put it into the organizational perspective, that really helps you to build a culture of appreciation. And we know, and it's already measured and it's already proven, that the people who feel appreciated, they're much more productive and they go above and beyond to contribute into the common cause, right? So these are the things that we're talking about. And I think it's wonderful because it gives you the power to make changes within And those changes, you could actually see how that goes into the external environment. So that's how we create the environment that we like, the ecosystem that we appreciate, right? And it's much more harmonious environment altogether.
You mentioned Silicon Valley, and I think if people had to think about the most stressful places in the world or where the amount of pressure is enormous, it would be Silicon Valley. I mean, if you fail in Silicon Valley, that's the end of your career sometimes. There's so much pressure from VCs, there's so much pressure from investors, etc., and to have success. And I'm sure you've seen tons of burnout cases who have come to you a little bit too late. So you've mentioned some of the tools that folks can consider and use to try and avoid burnout. But I see on your website, you've got executive coaching, leadership workshops, leadership retreats, team building, productivity training, conflict resolution. I suppose with burnout, conflict resolution is going to be quite important because you generally have a fuse, right? So when you're not operating at 100% or when you're under pressure, generally it's those closest to you that bear the full brunt of your anger or of what you're going through. Maybe talk to me about the importance of conflict resolution as well in the work that you do.
This is Jael. I think what we're talking about is really kind of raising the importance of emotional intelligence. And that bigger picture is that there is a fundamental transition that's going on right now that impacts all of us, and that's the impact of artificial intelligence. So if you think about how this is going to change the way we work, the way we manage people, the future of work, this is tremendous. It's really, we don't tend to think about it, day to day, but that's kind of the bigger picture. This becomes really a necessity to develop that emotional intelligence. So what's going to happen as a leader, you will be forced to manage a totally different set of people who are more autonomous, who are more entrepreneurial, people who have choices, right? And what you want from them is really their creativity. So they make that choice toward you. And for you to manage those people, you really need to have on top of your emotional intelligence. So speaking of conflict resolution, a lot of that really comes from our misunderstanding of the motivation of people coming into that conflict, right? So that's part of it. Part of it is our emotional reaction. When we react, we don't respond, but we react. So learning how to respond and not to react, that's a big part of that emotional intelligence. And it really happens on the individual level. You as a person need to understand yourself and your reactions and be able to regulate those reactions so that you could help others to resolve those conflicts and realize how these people from different motivations, they came to this situation and how we can help them to untangle it.
This must be quite tough for folks specifically in Silicon Valley who are probably more on the engineering or low EQ side of the spectrum, because these are typically folks who just want to get things done. And this is quite complex stuff to do. And this is not an overnight process. Obviously, you don't have one workshop and now they've got all of the skills that they need to deal with workplace activities. Talk to me about what, if I was an executive at a startup, what kind of program would you put for me to avoid burnout? Because I don't want to come to you and say, I'm burnt out, please help me. I'd like to say, I want to avoid burnout. I want to be the best leader that I can be. What kind of program would you typically take that person through? And do you do a diagnostic maybe in the beginning to figure out what their current situation is?
Yeah, so I personally am not a big proponent of a diagnostic. So I believe that a person reached out for help, that's a good diagnostic enough. So it means that, there is something that we can help with. So in terms of burnout and approaching this, so there are at least two levels that we usually take into this. The first level is your stress management techniques, right? So it's kind of like a Band-Aid. So you were mentioning earlier in our interview that one of the kind of symptoms that you went through during the burnout was the interruption in breath, right? So, and this is really interesting because breath is that bridge between your mind and your body. And that's one of the languages that our survival system understands. So once you manage the breath techniques, right? So like you can get control. You have this breath, a number of different breath work techniques. That's really how you can communicate with that system. So that would be a stress management tool, stress management technique. And for anyone, whether you're burnout or not in burnout, if you're a person in the modern life and, you work, whether as an entrepreneur or corporate, what have you, you want to have your toolbox of stress management techniques, first aid in the burnout. That's how you switch from flight or fight to rest and digest mode. Now, the second set are those practices that help you basically regulate your state. So one of those practices is relinquishing unnecessary control. A lot of leaders, a lot of founders, and a lot of entrepreneurs, they want to do everything themselves. This desire, if you start dissecting it, the big part of that is a fear. It's a fear that nobody else can do it as good as I can. And if it's not done as good as I can do it, then it's not worth doing, or this is not good, right? So that is really fear. So recognizing that as fear and putting practices in place to let go of that fear. And we have those tools, right? So when you ask, well, if it's not done exactly the way I want it to be done, what impact is it going to have 2 weeks from now? What impact is it going to have 6 months from now? And the answer is there will be no impact. That fear is really unnecessary, so you can let it go. So these are the things that, we would put in place as the practices of relinquishing unnecessary control, the practice of gratitude that we've already talked about, the practice of self-care. When you intentionally put into your existence the activities that bring you joy. So you intentionally add joy into your lifestyle. And what it does, it really brings that priority to that. We're saying that it's not selfish. It's not, that you are taking away from other people. It's really necessary for you to be that emotionally intelligent person, because then you can show up as the best version of yourself. So these are the practices that we're talking about. And again, as I said, you can completely tie it down to the culture of your organization. That's how your team is going to work. The gratitude will translate into appreciation. Self-care will translate into a very vibrant and full of energy team that you have, very motivated team. This unnecessary control will turn into a much better culture where there is a balance between autonomy and control that people in your organization appreciate. And rather than feeling that they are always under the watch of a big brother, they will actually have that freedom to contribute in the best way they can. And they will be much more loyal in that.
Yeah. And this works for both individuals and teams, obviously. So this is a process that can be done to support a larger team as well. If I had a magic wand and I said, who is your ideal client? Who is the person that you wish would use your services? Who would that be?
I love working with entrepreneurs and founders. These are people who really can make a difference. They usually are the ones who are happy to take responsibility. This work does require kind of self-responsibility, saying that, yes, I'm responsible for this. Yes, I'm responsible for being that role model that people want to follow.
Excellent. Now, my last question is, I see you have a piano behind you. What is the last thing that you are practicing playing?
I actually like reading, so it's not like I'm practicing. I'm just opening the sheet music, and it's kind of like a reading for me. And I love classical music, so now I'm kind of dabbling with the Christmas tunes, which is always fun.
Very nice. Well, I'm singing the Bach Christmas Oratorio very soon for Christmas, which is just so amazing. So
beautiful.
I love that. Okay, so Victoria, where am I going to send people to get in touch with you?
Yeah, so the website that you mentioned earlier is good. The best way and the fastest way to get hold of me is really through LinkedIn. Victoria Mensch, look me up. There's a way to connect. I'm happy to accept the request for connections and talk to you about these topics. I'm very passionate about them.
Excellent. I'm going to stick those links in the description for those of you who can't see it on screen now. But Victoria, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. It's such an important aspect of business that is sometimes forgotten. We talk about finance, economics, innovation, etc., but very little on the self-development side. We can see all of the best entrepreneurs and all of the best leaders in the world have a certain amount of self-awareness and can manage a good balance in their life. So, Victoria, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. Happy to be here.